Hey there. So to continue my video from last time on free will, I want to talk about the three levels of self-governance. They're not the only ones, but they're three of the main ones that we can come up with our own examples for quite readily, I hope, insofar as I've described these well. So this article is on my blog, on my website at overthoughtandunderstated.com. So to continue from that last post, self-governance and therefore free will is not as common as we'd like to think, but I intend to hold that it is still possible for everyone in certain cases, and following a degree of conscious effort to understand the self. That said, it seems plausible that it is not a function of most of us most of the time. So although there are many, I want to focus on three sources of self-governance from which we can draw principles for living. As I mentioned at the end of the last section or article, they can be from morality or truth, from self-enforced boundaries, which is essentially from the self, from the ego, or from external authority. That's from others. So appealing to external authority, it's the lowest form of self-governance. It's not really self-governance at all. I'll start there, okay? Appealing to external authority for the formulation of principles, regardless of how true those principles are or how good the results they are, that they produce are, is a logical fallacy. That is, it is an error of reasoning. Appeal to authority is something you learn about in philosophy or logic 101 as an unjustified basis of reasoning and truth. Okay, whether these rules are copied and pasted from your father, mentor, religion, or boss, nothing is true or good because of the person's position of authority. And you give up your own inner authority by blindly following that of another person. People have varying degrees of just authority, and such a degree may represent their ability to guide someone toward the truth, if it is indeed the truth for which they live. This means that they have good intentions. Good intention is unconditional and does not seek money or control. And it is only from those with good intention that we can truly learn anything. Still, lead us they need not. Their wisdom should merely help us to guide ourselves. It could, on the other hand, be that the authority is merely self-serving, as is the case for leaders for whom pride is the driving force of their reign, and one's ability or inability to distinguish between others' true or ill intentions means that one is vulnerable to selling their soul's autonomy to the ones who seek it. External authority is never the answer for principle setting. Self-enforced boundaries, on another plane, come merely from the self. They're often overcorrective flight response limits to external stimuli and events. So, although one is the sole conscious arbiter of these rules, they are at the willing hand of the world. So boundaries are not set with clear consciousness. They draw a line in the sand and say, I will do that and not do this, regardless of the circumstances, thereby paradoxically letting circumstances control their rigid minds. They shortcut the work one must do in order to adapt to external circumstances, to do right under any conditions, which requires cultivating a filter for what one will allow oneself to be influenced by. Boundaries, rather, build a wall against facing circumstances as they are. They mistake defensiveness for genuine protection, and they only delay the cultivation of one's character. So there's a lot of pseudopsychology out there right now telling people, especially, women to like set your boundaries, hold true to your boundaries. What are your boundaries based on? Simply having boundaries isn't necessarily going to serve you any good. They have to be based in truth. Okay. And so that's why, like, a father or a grandfather is supposed to, what they're supposed to instill in their children, and their grandchildren, is a sense of true boundaries, not just defensive walls that you build against the world. Okay. But if you have no sense of self, no sense of identity, then I suppose you have to start somewhere, right? You have to start building boundaries from some place in order to know that maybe they're not quite right. And then you tweak the way you do that until you become better at formulating actual true principles to live by. Right. So the human mind, much like the body, is anti-fragile. The more one is exposed to and observant of something, the more one understands its patterns, and the less one will fear it. Okay. Boundaries do not seek to understand things in themselves, but rather avoid those things from fear. However, this type of self-governance is a step in the right direction for someone who was previously guided more directly by, say, external authority. Right. So we have merely following the rules down here, and then holding boundaries for yourself up here, but it's still not up here where we want to be on a path to spiritual, true living, So genuine moral principles, in contrast, constantly voluntarily take on the challenge of being tested. It is as if one's belief system is in a constant state of exposure therapy. With every test, a principle gets stronger because it is both being exposed to its foe and making use of the wisdom gained from facing all of the tests from the past. Expose yourself to nothing and you will go weak. Principle must come from self-awareness, but not arrogance. And understand that the external world is not within one's control. Therefore, minor improvements occur in one's principles over time, instead of having rigid boundaries that don't budge, right? A principle-forming person knows that the only thing he can control is his responses to externals, based on his patterned understanding of those externals and how he is both a keen observer and a dutiful participant in all of reality. This type of person is a spiritual person who has gratitude for life and all of its struggles and joys, and they relish the duties of observation and self-improvement. This path implies a belief system in some universal conception of truth and goodness, and self-improvement equates to the process of sharpening one's perception as to orient them closer to that universal state with every thought, word, and action. So self-governance from the cultivation of moral principles is a path rooted in unconditional acceptance. So love, basically. Unlike boundaries, which are seen as good under the conditions that they don't cause one pain, or external authority, which has no intrinsic right to speak on others' behalves to begin with. And they're the only governance pattern, that is moral principles. The only governance pattern whose origin really is in truth and goodness for one and for all. Truth and goodness for one and for all is perhaps the core value. Jesus, that's fucking pop up here. Is perhaps the core value from which any sustainable principles originate, for it is universal and non-polar in nature, which relinquishes the ego's need to believe and prove things. And as it turns out, the ego rules most people in most situations. And those people would rather take the easy path of outsourcing their own moral authority anyway. So how many people is this message actually going to reach? All right. Anyway, that's my video today on the 3 levels of self-governance. Have a good night.